we're going to get into number two of the 3 keys to effective mentoring, and that's being trauma informed and culturally sensitive. Jeez. Okay, coming off of a holiday weekend, it's a struggle right now. So on the culturally sensitive part, and again, you guys had great conversation last week. So we talked about, what does that mean and how does that apply? But just want to point out that cultural sensitivity or responsiveness, as I like to call it, isn't about race. We know that folks of color are not a monolith, right? And we talked about that last week as well. So thinking about culture is important, and challenging ourselves to think about culture is important, because we can easily start to group folks in based on what they look like. And that doesn't necessarily align with their cultural realities, right? So generally speaking, I think we all generally know, right, that culturally sensitive is always about being thoughtful, that we have similarities and we have differences, and that we don't label them, right, as positive or negative or better or worse, right or wrong. They're just differences. And we should account for that in how we show up to the space. So we're not going to go into details about what that looks like. I highly encourage you to look into trainings that are available for specific cultures or races and ethnicities, religions, what have you, just to help yourself be aware. But as we talked about last week, showing up, acknowledging you're not an expert and asking for folks to give you support and ensuring that you're showing up to them properly goes a long way. So just a little quick sort of explanation of where bias comes from. I found this really cool. It's a visual. I didn't include it in the slides because it was just too much, but it was developed by Bobby Harrow, and it kind of talked about where biases come from and how do we liberate ourselves. And so, I think it's important for us to really think about how do we get to the point where when we see a person who looks a certain way or talks a certain way or walks a certain way, how do we get to the point where we automatically assume things about them, right? So, obviously we're born into this world where biases already exist, and there are systems in place that help manage those truths, if you will, the truth about things and people. And I do say truth with air quotes, right? We're given that truth by our parents, our teachers, and others all along life, right? So you think about when you went to school, whatever you were taught, which I think many of us have seen, and those of us who are of the minority population know that not everything we were taught in school was actually accurate, right? So we were taught all of these things, and we were taught by people who we love and trust, right? So they became truth. They became our beliefs, our norms, and our expectations about what is. And then, of course, over time, those things are reinforced as we grow older. If you think about what do you see on the news, what do you hear in songs? And so that sort of plants this seed in a conscious and subconscious way, right? Where if what we're constantly seeing is a certain race or ethnicity being presented only in a certain way, right? Then we start to assume that must be who they are and what that truth is, right? And so again, that reinforcement just happens every day. And no matter how big of a heart you have or how committed you are to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're all subject to this reality of, again, this uncontrollable, especially now with social media, is like all this content just hitting us all the time. And so whether we realize it or not, these things are being reinforced, right? So because we believe those things, and this is where it gets challenging, then we tend to kind of lock down into what we believe to be true. And then we ignore anything that doesn't align with that truth because it doesn't feel right. I don't know if you guys have heard the term cognitive dissonance, but it's like this funky feeling you feel when you believe something over here, but when you see and hear things that conflict with that, it kind of causes this rub within ourselves. And so we have a choice that we can make in that moment. And so when we choose to ignore that feeling or ignore things that may challenge what we think we know to be true, then ultimately what we're doing is reinforcing that bias, right? So on the flip side, then how do we liberate ourselves, right? So obviously we encounter information we already talked about, and it can be cause discomfort or be uncomfortable, right? So this training might be an example even in some of the content and comments we had last week, specifically on cultural realities, right? Maybe someone heard something that they didn't know, or it seems to conflict with what they had heard before, right? So we have a choice in that moment again, where we can either lean into that or not, right? So if we're going to liberate ourselves from bias, we have to make the choice to lean into that discomfort, lean into that moment where what we thought we knew about a certain group of people or about a certain topic might not be true, and then be willing to engage in opportunities to learn more, right? And then we take action to address the behavior that aligns with that, ideally. And then we expand those actions, right? By speaking up, speaking out. And I think we've seen with the social justice movement that continues, we've seen what this can look like. So just to kind of give a baseline of what that looks like. And I think this is important for us to know, and it's important for us to communicate this to mentors, because what we know, and I'm so thankful to have had an opportunity to work with so many mentors over the years. There's never a shortage of good intentions and big hearts, right? But sometimes folks show up so excited to help that there are blind spots. So it's really important that we are thoughtful about how we support mentors in being able to be willing, right, to lean into this discomfort and challenge themselves on what they know. So I'm going to pause right there, give you guys a chance to chime in so we can get it as conversational as we had last time. What do you think about bias in your space? How's it showing up for you? Have you seen it show up maybe with mentors you work with? And or what shifts should we be making, or should you be making, to maybe address if you see some areas for needed improvement?
Oh, sorry, someone else.
No, that's okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know we see some assumptions and biases show up with mentors, who are just learning about our program, that might make some assumptions about youth who live at or below the poverty line. There's this assumption that parents aren't present, or parents aren't, that they, and part of our orientation is really to talk about, when we talk about the mentor's role, and a parental supplement or replacement is certainly not it. But we really have to actively tell mentors, no, our members have wonderful families who work hard to support them. And so I know that that's one assumption that comes in a lot. It has to do certainly with the socioeconomic level that a lot of our members are at.
Yeah, that's a good one. That actually aligns with the trauma content we covered last week as well, right? To just assume that because folks are struggling with something, that means that they're not going to do well in school, or that they can't handle a certain responsibility, or that they're sort of assigned to a lesser opportunity in their career later in life, or what have you. So that's a good one, Tricia. Thanks for sharing. Maria, what were you going to share?
I was going to add, it's basically the same, but more into the culture. Okay. Having mentors predominantly white, it gives it the bias of like thinking that our population here in our clubhouses is basically 80% Latino. And so having white mentors with Latino community and families, it just gives the impression that, yeah, they are, like we were saying, the economic, all that part, like, I think gives it less perspective of, I don't know how to explain it, but you understand. It's just culturally, and just having mentors that are predominantly white understand, they just don't speak English, they don't know what this is, things like that. So
yeah, and I think it also sort of enforces the assumption that folks, in that case, that folks who are Caucasian, right, don't have any problems, don't struggle with poverty, don't need mentors because they have all the answers. Because when you come to spaces like this, you often see that those are the folks helping. So it really shows on both ends of the spectrum as it relates to the different populations represented. Thanks, Maria. Galen, were you going to say something? Okay.
And it looks like we have a hand up from Mai.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Mai.
Hi. Yeah, I think for one of mine is kind of like what Maria and Trisha shared. We have a lot of youth of color here, and a lot of our mentors who are able to mentor are predominantly white. But we shifted to more like mentors of color, and even having mentors of color, there's still misunderstanding because of different life experiences and what they bring into the space. But one of the things that we tackled right away that we learned from the biases from our mentors with our members is part of our orientation, like not orientation, part of our interview process. So what I would do is I would invite mentors to come see the space in action to see if they can vibe with the energy, because it's so fast paced. The youth are like moving and doing different projects. And that really is a tell of like a mentor can last or a mentor cannot last in our space. And that's how we decide like, okay, you'll be a good fit mentor or you won't be. Because they can see it in action and seeing who's using the space, what's happening. And then, we have teen employees here as well. And they kind of engage and talk with them briefly with me present, and then just kind of see like, okay, here are my perspectives, here are some biases that, I might have. And then I sit and talk with them. Like, these are the youth we serve. This is what may happen, but they can be the total opposite from this. And then also, if I do, once they get into the mentoring program, then I offer bi-monthly youth development topic under various different topics. So like, focus on like youth homelessness or young parenting or critical mentoring, things like that, just kind of help them. And having those one-on-one or group conversation with the mentors is helpful for them to understand their own bias and to be able to engage with youth.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I love those strategy. I think that the vibe piece is everything, right? Because it's one thing to hear about those little poor kids, right? And then there's being in the space with them and whether or not you're vibing or you're intimidated or whatnot. I do want to focus in on a word you shared that reminded me of something really important that I think we often miss when we talk about bias and cultural responsiveness and all that good stuff, is the word lifestyle. And it goes back to the slide, right? So I say, like, let's not assume that culture doesn't mean race. Culture means a lot of different things. It's alignment in lifestyle and beliefs and different things. And so going back to this idea that we're not a monolith, I think we can also make assumptions that if we, for example, see a person of color, that they wouldn't have any bias, or if we're a person of color, that we don't have bias, or if we're with someone who looks like us, that we then know them, right? And so I think that's another piece we have to really pay attention to, is that, again, it's not about the look, right? Because we're not a monolith. So we can have folks who have totally different lifestyles, totally different upbringings, totally different religions, totally different belief systems, who look similar, right? And so when we show up making assumptions based on what we see, we can miss it in different and not so obvious ways, because we think we got that because we know them because they look like us. And we all are at risk to do that. I would also argue that we need to think about the fact that even when we're aware of bias, and this is the power of having those reinforced messages always coming across the screen and the phone at us, is that even when we are aware of said bias, said stereotypes, and it's even about us, people who look like us, we can ourselves, if we're honest, have those same assumptions. So whether you're a female, right, and when you see other women, you make assumptions about their abilities or their skill sets or intelligence, right? Because we always get these messages that women aren't smart or women can't drive or whatever. Or if you're, for example, for me, an African-American, what thoughts cross my mind when I see a young Black man walking across the street? If I'm honest, do I have the same reactions at times that folks who don't look like me or that Black boy have? Like, so just being willing to challenge yourself to look in the mirror, as woke as you might say you are, right? We always have room to grow, and just really going deeper. If this is a topic where you kind of feel like you know that you still have room to grow and check in all the time, right? Because this is ongoing work. There's no finish line, right, to showing up without bias, because it's just something that's inherent within the human behavior, that we tend to try to figure things out before we have all the details. Like, that's just what we do, right? So just making sure, even when we're, again, woke and really progressive in this way, that we don't miss out on the opportunity to check in on our own opportunities to grow.